know how to follow that. I honestly don't. I am so pleased to be here. I first want to say good morning. Good morning. And I want to thank CASETA for this fabulous conference. I look out and see so many authorities and so many people that I've been privileged to work with. It's really kind of intimidating to get up here and talk on any subject in front of this group. But the subject that I was given, when Valerie asked me to be humorous and catchy, and to use a lot of slides. So, well, that's how I came up with that little byline about giant, because I thought, okay, everybody knows what that is. And it's certainly a lot of people's perception of the state of Texas and what we do here. And, but basically what I want to talk about is origins and outcomes. And it's such a huge topic. I'm going to do my best to condense that, and then we'll go forward from there. So, club women, culture, competition. I noticed when I just started this that many websites say that museums are the biggest, best, most, first, a lot of superlatives. I feel this competition between, you know, we did this and we did this, and we'll talk about that a little bit about how that shakes out, and I'll let you draw conclusions. I'm not going to draw any conclusions in that. So, just how was the cause of art for the citizens of Texas promoted, organized, and funded? And I know we had a wonderful speaker last night from the Baltimore Museum, and she used the term grassroots. Grassroots. The grassroots organizations of people coming together, really believing this is a cause and an important thing to do. What I'm going to present first will be museums by the numbers. I'm not the person who talks about numbers a lot, but the idea is to impress you with the numbers of museums in the state of Texas and in the United States. So if you look at this competition by the numbers, if you want some bragging rights, there are 35,000 museums in the United States and 123,000 libraries. And you can see that I got this from the IMLS figures from 2015. So if you look down at the bottom, we're number 3. It's an impressive number 3. And this is just a large view of how we talk about this. So another interesting way to look at this is numbers per capita. And I will say this, if we go with per capita, the winner in Texas is Terrell County, Texas. They have a population of 903, and they only have one museum. But if you look at it that way, that one institution makes them certainly bastions of culture by the numbers. So numbers are good, but we all know experience is what this is about. So this chart may be a little bit difficult to read, but then how we talk about numbers by discipline. What does the particular museum do? And that long brown line in the middle, that's history. So history wins in this category. Historic societies, historic preservations, not all Texas history, but that seems to be the lion's share. So we have arboretums, children's museums, general museums, historical societies, history museums, zoos, and arboretums. And when they talk about, that's what they're talking about, museums and how they work. You can also break this down by budgets. There are 9 categories in this by budget, from $1 to over $500 million annual budget. So they break them down by categories to talk about that. If we talk about geographical region, we're down here in the Mountain Plains geographical region, where Texas comes in with that. So when you think about museums and how we talk about museums, there are a lot of different categories, classifications, a lot of ways to analyze them. You can think about the Panhandle Plains Museum. I see Michael sitting here. It's a historical museum, but they have fabulous art, all right? Okay, so there are things that are morphed. Some places have archives. Some focus on this particular type of media. So each museum has its own mission statement, driven by the board, and we're all trying to be relevant in the 21st century. But it all started once upon a time. This is going the wrong way. This is a short list of Texas art museums. You may see your favorite on here, but this is just an idea. I'm just giving you an overview of this. And this is all from the IMLS data. And they're not all in big cities. They're university art museums. And they have a different kind of mission. Generally, they're under the oversight of a university and the university president, and the association with that also helps them drive their mission, and that's a short list. We have university museums in Abilene. They're not listed here. There's also art centers. So art centers are different because very often they have a particular, maybe they're artist driven, maybe they do local art, maybe they have a particular kind of media that they focus on. So if you read through that list, just take a quick list, and you can see there's all different kinds. Art centers are not necessarily a museum. So if we think of museums as collecting institutions, it kind of sets it apart a little bit. So then there are Texas nonprofit organizations. So when you look down here, you're going to see Texas Commission of the Arts. And when I was on that grant panel, one of the things that we were asked to do was to review 66 grants, and I know several people in this room have been on that before, 66 grants that had to do with their budget, and it was a great learning opportunity to see how varied all of the different museums are in the state, and where their funding comes is also a big part of this. So now we'll get to the point. How did we get to this point? So many fabulous art institutions alive and well. And how did it start? Because we know that was not always necessarily how it was in the beginning. Let's see, let me get through my notes here. This is a photo of Mrs. Digby Roberts' home at the corner of North and Hickory Street in Abilene around 1901. If you look carefully, there's a piano. Looks like an easel. Mrs. Digby Roberts was educated in the East in arts and music. Her husband was a mayor. These kinds of associations are an interesting way to think about how did a town that looked like this have art and create art museums, and how did that cause happen? And a lot of it came from institutions, from individuals and women's clubs to make those things happen. So that was that commerce and culture. How do you get those two things together? It's an important part of the conversation. Some people say, when was the first art exhibit? And I've heard it said in 1837, Kentucky portrait painter Thomas Jefferson Wright was showing his paintings and selling them at a museum, at a hotel in Houston. So my question is, does that count as an art exhibit? I don't know, but there was art there. And when I did research on a lot of museums, there were instances of individuals showing art, having things in everything from the bank to the lobby of the Chamber of Commerce and different places that kind of didn't get on the record, but it was part of that grassroots idea. I'm going to talk a little bit more about these people, Culturebearers. And I'm going to use a quote from Light Cummings, who is here, and I want to encourage you to read his Women in Texas series if you're interested in this subject. It's really quite extraordinary. They may look like your grandmother, but there's a lot going on. Light's term for Culturebearers, a person who works publicly to advance cultural endeavors, including the arts, in a variety of venues, and who fosters civic activities permitting such undertakings to flourish in an institutionalized manner. He writes really well. Not only does such a person embrace culture in her own life, but also consciously seeks to transmit it successfully to others through programs, activities, organizations, and institutions. And this is in his essay about Allie Tennant. And many of the women artists that we talk about, and we've had some wonderful discussions here at CASETA about them, were club women. This was something they were really proud to be part of, and they had a great deal of influence because of that association. We tend to think of artists as kind of one-dimensional, that they're always in the studio making things, but they have a really interesting life. And so many of the people early on were activists. They were really activists for this cause, and had really interesting life stories. This particular picture was taken in 1910, and you might be surprised it's Abilene, Texas. Okay, the population at the time was 3,000 people. I think most of them are on the lawn here. Many members are listed, they came from out of town. If you missed 2 meetings, you were kicked out. This is serious business. Robert's Rules of Order. This is not something that had casually just showed up and had tea. And I really think subsequent generations of feminists have kind of decided they were not serious. We think of that, they didn't want to be like their grandmothers. They didn't want to have tea, there were no more tea time activities. And they were able, I think, to accomplish some of the things they accomplished about equality in the workforce because of what these women accomplished. So I think we need to take a better look at them. You might be interested to note, if I can get this to work, there's a man in here. There's a gentleman. But these are not glamorous women, and notice they're women of all ages. The ones in the front are officers of the club, and they have pennants, they had mottos, they had colors, really interesting. But this was serious business, no matter how you look at it. So what we're talking about, post-Civil War Texas, and many women's only groups were really the only way that these women could organize and do anything, because there was not really an opportunity for them to speak publicly. They were involved with church activities, and let me go back. This is from the newspaper. This sewing circle, what are these women up to? I mean, this is kind of where it started. This is not church. Their husbands are not here. They wouldn't have gone into her sewing circle. Opportunities like that gave them opportunities to network out from under male authority. They were able to do very interesting things, and I think that's maybe where some of this actually started. So women's only groups, because it was culturally, the way the culture was divided by race and gender lines very much at that time. We can be judgmental about that, but just think about what they dealt with, what they had to do, and then what they accomplished. And it sounds a little bit different. I don't see them as victims. I see them very proactive, and they did some pretty amazing things. One of the things that these women were very interested in was libraries. So the Shakespeare Club that we just saw earlier, that was, they say they're the first women's study club. The Texas Federation gave them that. I'm sure someone is going to contest that. But 1873, organizing. When was the Civil War over? I mean, really, it's pretty incredible that those women got together and did that. They chartered, very official what they did. One of the things they were, how are you going to study Shakespeare if you don't have any books? They were a network. They got pamphlets. They made costumes, and part of their job was to teach. There was a self-education. They're teaching each other. So you might be given a particular role. You showed up, and you would do your part, and you would teach the other ladies after tea, of course. But you would do that. They were very serious about this education, reaching out into the larger world, but libraries were a very important part of that. And one of the ways education got spread for women was through the Chautauqua and Lyceum movements. And if you've read anything about this, is the post-Civil War, think tent meetings, Elmer Gantry. This was a whole family would make the trip. Women came. They got to hear interesting ideas that they probably didn't hear at home, but they were camp meetings. They would camp out and go to these meetings. They had speakers from all over the world. They had libraries. They had subscription libraries. All of these things. It's taking education out beyond. Very popular in Texas. And if you'll notice, that one says Abilene on it. I'm using that because I have most of that material in the museum. But think about that. And women coming along with their families just accidentally learn about suffrage. And a lot of these had opera, They had different kinds of things that people are exposed to firsthand. So I think this is a civilizing thing. Also, there were a large number of subscription catalogs and books that were out there. The North American Review, published in 1815, was highly read. It could come in your mailbox on your rural route, but you could have that information. Also, Godey's Ladies Book. If you ever come across a copy of that, women all over the United States read that information. So, but the public library was basically what they wanted to do. And I just want to pause and show you this. There are problems in researching women. Because if you read about Ellen Gaines's sister, I don't know who that was. Most women at this particular time, under the laws of the United States, went by English common law. By marriage, a husband and wife are one person in law. That is, the very being and legal existence of the woman is suspended during the marriage, and at least it's consolidated. And under the husband's protective wing, she covers all of her activities. So Mrs. George so-and-so. And so if you want to find out her maiden name, if you'll notice we know about her brother and her husband and her son, but I don't know anything about her. A lot of these women's clubs groups, I don't think most of us knew what they were doing, and they didn't talk to their families about it. I don't know if they had a secret code, but anyway, they did not. It was not in their obituaries. So if you want to research them from the obituary point of view, it makes it very, very difficult to do so, because some people say they're in the shadow and the cloak of invisibility. I don't know if that's necessarily true, but it's one of the reasons that it's hard to come up with exact names during this time. And a lot of women only became active in these groups when they were widowed or if they were spinsters. Spinsters always had Miss in front of their names so that we'd know for sure, but they were activists, many of them. So this is just a sampling of some of the things that I have in the museum. The American Women's Club movement began in 1868 when Jane Cunningham Crowley, a professional New York journalist, was denied admittance to an all-male press club event in which Charles Dickens was speaking. She could not believe that she could not go. So she decided she would begin federated women's clubs were organized, women's only clubs at that level. So if you're not granted admit, but if you can look at the titles on some of these, it's really interesting. All different kind of interests of these clubs. And then they become organized together under a federated mantle. And we have, I love the motto up here. I'm not sure what they were afraid to do, but they're surely going to go forward into the future. So the units were very interested in art, music, books, and different civilizing activities for their communities. If you think about this is during the era called the progressive movement, turn of the 20th century, very few women were in the workforce, once again, widows and spinsters and people without any help. But certain kinds of work were unsuitable for women. It would require more intelligence than women could possibly muster. This is actually a quote. And could possibly muster. And because that stripped them of their modest demeanor to be in the workforce. So acceptable pursuits for women made it very, very difficult. And I think it's important to think about the culture, how people interact in the culture they're born into. I mean, there were expectations for men and for women, and how you navigate that is a real interesting part of the story. Education wasn't necessarily available to women, especially co-educational education. So Baylor University in 1865 actually had co-ed classes. And there were other places that did not, and certain classes were co-ed. Art was a question. Usually that was taught by the wife of the president who took some art classes, and then she started an art class, and they were just totally surprised when everybody signed up to do it. So that's how a lot of those art departments started. So eventually what we have, by the 1890s, we have a national network. When I came to the museum, I thought, how did they have all this information? They had state chairmen, every city had a chairman, and then they're connected to the nationwide network, and they're all communicating on lovely pink scented stationery, sometimes typewritten, and people have that in their archives. It's a fascinating story. I I've heard several people say it, but I've seen things, we're a small museum and we don't have much money. Dear Metropolitan Museum of Art. I mean, very ambitious. They didn't think they had any boundaries. I love these old photographs. They're in the District of Columbia at the National Convention, where many of these people merged, shared ideas and objectives. Here's a real sinister looking group of women. This is the National American Women's Suffrage Association in 1890. There's Susan B. Anthony, number 5 in the front row. Women's organizations were considered radical and subversive movement. How can those ladies with hats and tea be subversive, okay? Addressing the new women's club phenomena, President Grover Cleveland warned in 1905, Ladies' Home Journal, they ignore the tenor of the ways of womanhood and thwart the integrity of homes, neglecting the precious interests of home and motherhood. These are activists. They may not look like activists to you. You'll notice they're very serious about what they're doing. So this gives you maybe a different view of who you think these women were. And maybe they were stripped of their modest demeanor, but they're certainly dressed modestly, considered. Texas women's suffrage comes 1919. Took a huge effort, and that was one of the first things they wanted to do. We have a little political poll. It's interesting to note, when the vote was gotten, many women still didn't vote because it was not culturally acceptable. So you can change the law, but it didn't make culture change. Okay? So the Texas League of Women Voters came along to go door to door and get women to sneak out and vote without their husbands knowing they were doing so. So they're sneaky too. And I like to say that there's some really interesting information about the African American women's clubs that were being organized at the time. In Abilene, we had one called the Charmette Club. And they were interested in some of the same things, but they're segregated by race, and I think it's a great topic for people to do some research on. And if you have anything in your museum or at your hands, I think it would be great to bring them out of the shadows and talk about what they actually accomplished as well. Most of the groups we're talking about were middle and upper class women, and mostly white women. So, so it's an interesting division, but those are the times. It doesn't mean the other people didn't do anything, okay? It's just the information that we have. By the time we get to the 20s, everybody looks different. They don't have any undergarments. They're all very loose and happy and on the move. We've got those corsets out the window. I think I pull a hat down instead. But look at them. 1921, the mayor's wife was Mrs. Dallas Scarborough in Abilene, and we see this going on again. She's talking, she's being members of these groups. The charter for the 1929 Women's Club to promote the cultural and civic advancement of Abilene, Texas, through the study of literature, history, science, and art. How does art get into that conversation? Obviously, some of these women had studied other places. They were very interested in the cause. And I'm saying this story, it's just happening all over the state. If it's happening in Abilene, it's happening other places. I'm just not using examples to that. Many of these women, for 6 years straight in Abilene, they were state chairman of the Art League and part of the Texas, the American group, the Federated Club. So they went to convention. They collected materials, and that's how that all got started. So, and one of the products, and the person very involved with this is Frances Fisk, and once again, like Cummins has given us a great deal of information about her. What an amazing life. I don't know when this woman ever slept. But she collected this book, and if you have copies of it, I think they're out of print, but it's the first art history book, History of Texas Art, Texas Artists and Sculptors, and I have it open to the page. Abilene is the Athens of West Texas. So, this is ambition. Small towns thinking they're going to be big cities someday, but they're certainly not going to be left behind. So this network, this book is fascinating. And the way she did, I looked at it, I thought, how does she do this? How did she do this? Well, she wrote all of the city chairs and asked them what was going on in their community. They sent her letters. She compiled, this is a compilation of letters and essays from city chairmen about what's going on, and they're all about supporting Texas art. the artists that live in Texas. So this is like the first book, and there are others that come after that. But when you think about the circumstances we've just talked about, it's really pretty extraordinary. Great resource. So I think I'll do a quick run through here when we talk about how a lot of these museums got started. The Carnegie, and I'm from Texas, I'll say Carnegie, okay? This is the Carnegie Libraries in Texas, a really interesting story because so many of these morphed into museums. This is the Fort Worth one, and I want you to notice when I show you these, the terms for who's first goes to chartered, funded, and then open, okay? Those are different things. And then one even says intent to be an art museum. So they're going to try to claim first place. We're still competitive, what can I say? The Carnegie Libraries, there were 32 public libraries. If you ever want to study that and look that up, it's really interesting how that took place. Four serving the original purpose, and most are destroyed or demolished because we became very interested in being modern, and a lot of those things went by the way. Or Public Library Association and Art Gallery. So that's how they claim being first, because they said they were an art gallery. A lot of museums, libraries in existence today have collections. They started out with those collections. Sometimes it went to the city, sometimes they basically morphed into a museum, but that was probably one of the first public places the women's clubs could meet here. We know the story about how that happened. I love the story, the legend that when the ladies from the Fort Worth Public Library Association approached Andrew Carnegie, Andrew Carnegie said, "Why don't you get the guys to help you?" Put pressure on them to raise money or matching funds. And he said, ask local gentlemen for the price of a good cigar to help out with raising the money to make this happen. And those stories are really interesting because the all-male group raised the funds, and then the library was eventually opened. I think it's kind of sad. So they used local architects, but there was matching funds, and they also had to raise the money for books and keep it staffed. Most of the staff were volunteers, and the number of hours they logged to do this is really pretty impressive. And there's a whole sequence of names of different associations and groups that came together to make this happen. This is what is granted. That's when the money, they may have chartered it someplace, but when the funding came through, the doors opened quite a while later, but Dallas asked for two. They had a branch, and then they had this wonderful old building. They had an art room by 1901. And there was supposed to have been an exhibit in the courthouse in 1857 of Hudson River paintings that got a big press in Dallas. But now to have an organized space where these things could happen, they gave an exhibition in the art gallery that was by far the best collection ever seen in the state of Texas. And that quote, okay? We really want to be the best. We want to be do the most and be the best. And be first. Got to be first. So the Dallas Art Association, everything morphs, and eventually there's a great quote from the director, 1929, I think, and maybe I've got 1930. Nature made Dallas rich, time will make her powerful, and only art can make her great. Here we have Houston, and Houston Carnegie Library opens. It was a $65,000 building, a local architect, and they had a segregated branch. We may look disparagingly on that, but I'm going to say good for them. Dallas Museum of Fine Arts will eventually come from this organization, the Houston Museum of Fine Arts. There's the Houston Art League. It's a whole list of women's organizations that come together to make this happen. It's a fascinating story. The Museum of Fine Arts first building opened to public in 1924. So Houston Art League changed its name in 1924 from the Houston Art League, and it became the Museum of Fine Arts Houston. So when you go back and look at things, those things get forgotten, but they morphed and grew over time. San Antonio, this building was chartered. It's also demolished. Really interesting. These kind of neoclassical or revival buildings to, like temples to art or temples to books, temples to learning. Very serious intent. The whole story of the San Antonio and how it started with women's organizations, morphed into other organizations, and we'll look at a few people, if I have time, who are involved with that. This is the Abilene Carnegie Library, and of course we lost it too. But here are some pictures from people bringing their children there and reading books. Very exciting thing. Libraries are wondering how to stay relevant in the digital age. So are museums. It's an interesting thing. But what a great history, what a great legacy. And I'm going to give you a little surprise. As far as being first Carnegie Library, Pittsburgh, Texas wins. A few months, but they actually chartered, if you see here, before. And they had the distinction to be the first Carnegie Library grant in Texas, and only the 8th Carnegie Library chartered outside of southern Pennsylvania. Maybe he liked the fact that it's spelled differently and it's after Mr. Pitts, but it looks similar, right? Okay, well maybe that's when they got the first charter. It burned in 1939, which is really kind of sad. But I think we need to remember that in smaller communities, people were just as ambitious. We morphed into really impressive and large institutions. But I have a whole list of these libraries/museums that are now community centers, offices, if they still remain. I think there's quite a few. Most of them are on the National Register. So I'm going to give you a quick view of some of the institutions that came from all of this. The Modern Art Museum of Fort Worth is the oldest art museum in Texas, and Fort Worth people are going to say, and museums, and one of the oldest museums in Western United States. Okay, interesting claim. So in Carnegie Public Library, 1901, Fort Worth Museum of Fine Arts, 1910, Fort Worth Art Center, 1954, Fort Worth Art Museum Center, 1971, Fort Worth Art Museum, 1974, Modern Art Museum of Fort Worth, 1987. All comes from the same thing. It all started one place and then evolved other. Really interesting stories about each one of these. Obviously, I don't have time to talk to you about all of them, but really fascinating about individual women, how they championed these things and how hard they worked to make them come to fruition. Museum of Fine Arts Houston is located in the Houston Museum District. I mean, this is a campus now. Am I right? Originally started out as the Public School Art League. It doesn't sound as impressive, does it? But that idea of education is very much a part, and the school there, and who studied there, and how that came about was really fascinating. One of the people, and I'm sure Mr. Tibbetts could tell us all about this, Emma Richardson Cherry, 1913, the Houston Art League. She was an activist. She was an artist. She was a club woman. She wanted art for the community. She was a teacher. I don't know when you have time to do anything else. But really fascinating. So when you look at her art and you read more about her, think of her role in the Museum of Fine Arts Houston and the things that she did to make that happen. We love her art, but there's also another facet to her. So the intention, this is the museum that says it was dedicated as the Houston Public School Art League, later the Houston Art League, with the intention of becoming as a museum, and so they're saying they're the eldest. So Fort Worth and Houston can work that out. I'm not really sure who's the eldest. And sometimes when people say they're the largest, they're also saying what's their square footage, how many pieces in their collection. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to look at that. And we know this particular artist and her involvement there is really legendary. I'm skipping over a lot of this. She became the teacher of design classes and served as the curator of the museum from 1941 to 1967. So she believed museums were important. She was making her own art. Her story's fascinating, but her involvement with the museum is what I want to focus on here. She was a member of the Houston's Women's Clubs, okay? That was one way that she promoted this cause of art in Houston. So there are other museums that have donors or collectors that become public museums. This is different from this grassroots effort. It comes because someone has a fabulous collection, and those museums usually have the name of a person over the door because they were the person who collected things. And this is also where commerce comes in. We used to, they would have had enough money to buy local art and bring it to buy worldwide art and bring it together, and a lot of those things we see on view in museums today. So read the labels. Read the labels, you'll find all kinds of interesting. Curators work really hard on those things, but there's all kinds of little bits of information in there. It is a gem and the beautiful architecture. And in 1950, Marion Cougar McNay left her collection and more 700 works of art along with the house in 23 acres. So now we have gardens, and what they're claiming here is that the first museum of modern art in Texas. So read all the details when you look at that. It's really an outstanding place. You might not know about Ellen Schultz and the things that she did to help the San Antonio Museum Association. It had a lot to do with the Whitty, and it had to do with other organizations. But she was a naturalist. She had a group of followers. She liked to do landscape painting, but she was also a huge champion of museum and the things that were going on at the time. So there was also a woman, Mrs. Quinlan, that was the first director of the Whitty. They paid her $1 a year, and she held that position for 34 years. That's dedication. It's dedication. I don't know that her name is on anything at the Whitty, but it should be. I think it's important for us to think about who the founders are. You might have, museums could have Founders Day. They have relatives, if you want to think about it that way. But, it's an interesting story that I think has been left off. Of course, a lot of us know Eleanor Underdon's story and her involvement here. Curated the Whitty for many years, a position she held, I believe, in 27 to 58. And you see her there. I love that picture of her working behind her desk, as is where most curators are most of the time, when we don't get to get out and look at the real art. She studied in New York, Pennsylvania Academy, and of course, her father was Robert Jenkins Underdon. So we can think of those connections and how all of those things play out. The Dallas, this is a lovely picture of how I first saw the Dallas Museum of Art in Fair Park. How it became what it is today. It started out with the Dallas Public Library and Frank Ray, artist, saw the new library as a great place to show art. So he started organizing things. And he got the women's groups involved with this. So the museum renamed as the Dallas Museum of Art in 1932 and relocated in 36 to this building for the centennial. We're going to hear more about the centennial from other speakers here. So this gives us, and of course, Jerry Bywaters is director and a great motivator, and a lot of great Texas art was shown there. And of course, his role, everybody knows that name. So there's a lot of history about how all that came to be. Allie Tennant, once again, Dr. Like Cummins, a wonderful article about her and her involvement. This is a dedicated club woman. She was a member of a variety of women's study clubs, Arts Association, limited to women only. Her activities in this club and organized, and this is Light's words, legitimized art appreciation as an important form of civic engagement for many Texas women. So that crossover from not knowing much about art to all of a sudden being champion of art, it took individuals to help them see this. I think there's also a phrase that he uses that it extended their domestic duties into the civic world. You know, you could think about that. It became acceptable. And eventually it's an important role for civic leaders to have their wife involved with the arts, and you can see how that happens. There happened to be an associate of hers, Mrs. Catherine Lester Crawford, who had studied in Paris, and she had a beautiful home in Dallas, and she had a large collection. It was supposed to be first-class American art in her home, and it was open to the public several days a week. So was that the first museum? I don't know. That was it was the 1897 she started opening her home. School tours, and Allie Tennant was supposed to have been one of the students who came through and looked at those things and saw real art and became interested, and they became lifelong friends. We all know the story here. I love that photo of her. Work until the end. Keep it going. Vivian Luis, painter, art teacher, born in Virginia. She taught at several different institutions. She had her own art school, and she was one of the first teachers for Miss Crawford's school. She was teaching in her school and Miss Crawford's school. Once again, that's in the energy involved here. It's really quite interesting. By 1909, she was heading the art department of Dallas Women's Forum, Women's Club, and became the driving force in establishing the Texas Artists Annual. So when you read about that, think about her. And that began in 1911. So it's really an interesting part of the story. And I put this up here because this is in my archive. This is the Hall of Chamber of Commerce in Abilene. And you notice they're so excited. They're having their 10-year anniversary. Still don't have a museum. They convinced the mayor at the time to let him use part of the West Texas Chamber of Commerce building downtown. They even convinced him to move his office and let him use the office for storage because they started collecting and they didn't know what they were going to do with it. So great ideas, and then how does all this play out? I'm the recipient at the Grace Museum of their collection and how it started in the 30s, and it's been fascinating to study how it got there, what they did, to see all that backstory. And sometimes the backs of the paintings are just as interesting as the front because they kept all of that documentation. So this is the Art League and the Women's Forum and Federated Clubs. They went to the mayor, Amos, and said, we're going to do this. We're going to have an art museum. Then he elected a man as the chair, figurehead, and the women did all of the work, right? But he got the glory, and they did all the hard work to make it happen. So when you look at the names listed, you might think about that, who actually made it happen. They were open 2 afternoons a week. They had tea receptions. They were hosted by members of the Art Forum, and their names were published as hostesses in the newspaper. And what they wore was very much part of the report, more than things that were on the wall. They collaborated on American Art Week, the Southern Circuit, Texas Annual, Texas Art Organized for Art Education, and wants the cause of art for the citizens of Abilene. Membership was $1 a year, contributing members $2, supporting member $5, sustaining members $10, and the lifetime membership was $100. Interesting thing is too, they also had mimeograph sheets when they would have the art up, and you could vote for the one you liked best, but you had to pay for something for it, for your vote to count. So it could be a penny, it could be $5, but they tallied those votes. And that's how, and then of course somebody kicked in probably the lion's share of the cost, but that's how many of the original things came to the museum. But they saw it as a public duty. They thought the public should be involved. They were educating them, but they wanted to have ownership of it. They wanted them to be a part of it. So their names on all the documents, all the lists of the people who were involved in it. Art Unit of the Women's Forum. American Art Week, really interesting. I'm going to read just a little bit of the statement on the bottom, if you can't read. The level of citizenship of the civilization achieved by a nation in the past is judged today more truly on the evidence of works of art produced by its own artists. They're promoting American art. They're kind of shunning European ideas. And then from the American art, it becomes Texas art. Becomes a really important part of their cause. The own artist, more important than any other records that have survived. So you can build big buildings, you can do all things, but their art hanging in museums will outlive us all. To excel at art, therefore, is something of greater ultimate importance than the attaining of seeming greatness of wealth, and I would add first place, second place, third place, biggest and largest. Population and domain. A lot of these towns didn't grow very big. They've been very static. but their intent was just the same. The credit for foreign works of art, foreign works of art imported by the rich goes to the alien peoples who artists produce them. So they don't want any of that other stuff. They want their own stuff. And very interesting comment. All who would do their bit in building of their nation and their state should choose to buy artists from their own country and their own region. So you can see that on the back of some of the paintings. So I will conclude with this. We all know what this is, right? You all think that the glory happened in the East. And this is what Jordan Benedict said to Leslie when he went to Maryland to buy War Winds. We all remember that scene, you know. And she's grilling him on Texas history. And he gets a little upset. And I think we could all agree that the glory does not all happen back east. This is a 1957 movie. We've just been talking about the interwar years and all that happened in the progressive era and how these things came into being. So I think it's always wanted to know who did that painting in the back. Does anybody know? Anybody know? If you look on the sets, if you watch the movie, there's art. I think that is also seen in his office later on, but anyway, it's kind of Frankway-esque, but it's not it. I don't think so. I think somebody could feel that. One of the things that inspired me with this was Katie Robertson Edwards in her Abstract Impulse essay wrote that in 1928, the artistic reputation of the Lone Star State was belittled before a national audience in Time magazine. Everybody read Time magazine. I don't think any of us all read the same magazines now or watch the same TV shows or the same music or movies, but there was a day, and Time magazine was the leader. Its critic said, Texas has never been closely associated with the products of good art.
Judy, what was the date of the last rotation?
So how do you think
it was Time magazine that was
for this? And I think we all still find it
1928. I think that really does.
This critic had never been to Texas. Thank you very much.
Wonderful headliners coming in.
Judy, what was the date of the last rotation?
It was Time magazine that was 1928. I think that really does.
A lot of us kind of have this inferiority complex. We've got to speak up. We've got to be best, most, first, because we want a larger audience to hear what we have to say. But the great thing about this conference is that we have a pretty good idea who we are and what happened here. And how those things happen, and we certainly have a great appreciation for the art that was created in the state throughout all of that time period. Anybody else? Yes.
I know we were specifically talking about the women and their contribution, and besides the widows and the spinsters,
Yes.
in your studies that there was any kind of thing that you kept noticing about, like maybe the husband's role, like did they have certain occupations that might have made them wives more likely to be interested? I mean, were they architects and their wives were interested in art?
Yeah, I think it depends on the community that you're talking about. Mm-hmm. Yes, I'm not excluding the fact that there were many men involved with this. I'm just talking about this particular thing because I think it's a bit of an unsung story, and I'm kind of championing that. But yes, there are men's names, and sometimes I don't know who those people were or why they were on that committee. It's just like the image I showed you from 1901 of the Shakespeare Club. There was a man in that photo. There were children. I don't know the rest of the story. And it's like what I said about the African American groups and different groups that were divided for different reasons because that was the culture. But I'm sure there were some, and there's more research to be done. It's just the beginning of the conversation. And it's one of the things that I enjoy about working at the Grace Museum, because I think sometimes, and this is a quote that was given to me by an artist I work with, you can kind of come in the conversation here and start the conversation. And once that starts, it's really interesting to get other people on board and make things happen. And so there's more research to be done, and that's a really good question, really good question. All right, thank you very much.